Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book, Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. Two, because I'm a fan of punk music. And three, it's just more fun, right? Anyway, if this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. And please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsco.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. Anyway, that's enough for me right now. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Jon Picoult, who is the founder of Watermark Consulting, a leading customer experience advisory firm. And for all you people that are in the weeds on customer experience, you will know that Watermark Consulting are responsible for their landmark research on the ROI of customer experiences, because it's one of the industry's most widely cited studies. But that's not why he's here today to talk to me. He's here to talk to me about something else, which we'll get into in a minute. But Jon, how are you? Welcome to the podcast.
I'm good, Adrian. It's great to be here with you.
So Jon, for the benefit of our listeners and the people that are going to read the highlights, can you give us a bit of a background thumbnail sketch on who you are and the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you noted, I'm the founder and principal of Watermark Consulting, which is a customer experience advisory firm that basically helps companies impress their customers and inspire their employees, creating the kinds of raving fans that drive business growth. Before I launched Watermark back in 2009, I spent a little over 15 years in senior executive roles at Fortune 100 companies, leading at various times, sales, marketing, service, distribution, even IT. And I'm also a keynote speaker on customer experience and leadership topics. And as you alluded to a moment ago, I've got a new book that's coming out, and it's called From Impressed to Obsessed, 12 Principles for Turning Customers and Employees into Lifelong Fans.
Well, thank you for that segue, Jon, because you just kind of stole my thunder a little bit, but that's fine.
Dear.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Because you just kind of, told people about why we're here and why you're here today. It's to talk about the book From Impressed to Obsessed. But what I want to ask you is, can you give me tell me a little bit about it and what is its main thesis and who's it for?
Sure. So, the book, the central idea behind the book is that if you are aspiring to satisfy your customers, then you're aspiring to mediocrity. And I say that because to create real, sustainable competitive advantage, you can't just rely on satisfying the people that you work with. You need to impress them. You need to leave an indelible positive impression in their minds that makes them excited to work with you again and to tell others about you. And forging those impressions is really an exercise in shaping people's perceptions and memories. And that's where the cognitive science of customer experience comes into play, which is a main focus of the book. Because it turns out that companies that do this well are really all using the same set of science-based experience design techniques to create those memorable impressions. And the book distills those techniques into a dozen actionable principles that can be applied to any type of business and any kind of customer, whether you're working with consumers or colleagues, institutions or intermediaries, employees, or even employment candidates. And that kind of gets to your second part of your question, which is, who is the book for? And, the book uses a very broad definition of customer. And the book is really about using these experience design techniques to enhance the experience for anyone that you serve, to serve them all with distinction. And sometimes your customer isn't the individual consumer that's writing the check for your products or services. Sometimes your customer is the colleague that's just a few steps away from you. And the book is going to help all of those people, regardless of who they serve, regardless of what type of industry they're in, to deliver those memorable impressions that are going to make their customers, their colleagues, and others want to work with them again and rave about them to others.
I think you're, before we dive into sort of the book and stuff, I think you just alluded to something which I bang on about on the odd drum every now and again, which is this idea of how internal service or internal experience between colleagues and between teams is a really important thing, but often overlooked sort of thing. So I'm really pleased to hear that you cover that in the book, because I think it's a really important. It's almost like the cogs within the machine, right? And it doesn't necessarily get the attention that it often deserves.
Yeah, it is. I think a really big blind spot for many companies in their customer experience strategies is not paying enough attention to the internal customer experience, which necessarily underlies the quality of any external experience that you're providing.
Yeah, perfect. Now, I want to ask you a couple of questions about the book. Which, we don't want to do the chapter and verse in the book. We just want to give people a flavor of what's going on and give them some of the ideas. But before we get into sort of, as you talk about the kind of these 12 principles or some of the experience design stuff that many of the leaders are using to kind of to get out in front, I want to sort of back up a little bit and ask you, because you address this in the book, you talk about the most universal problem in customer experience today. And I wanted to ask you, so what do you consider as the most universal problem in customer experience today?
Yeah. There are two that I would highlight. At the beginning of the book, you're right, it does cover this. But, one is, I think that many companies neglect to appreciate the wide spectrum of touch points and interactions that really comprise their customer experience. It's as a result, any attempts that they make to really enhance the experience are sub-optimized, because they're focusing on interactions that they think are important, that they think are prominent, but they neglect to really appreciate that there could be a whole host of interaction points that they might view as almost administrative in nature. Yet they actually exert a very material influence on people's perceptions about the business. And I think a great classic example of this is like with health insurance companies.
Right.
Here in the U.S., health insurers send out, when you have a claim, they send out what's called an explanation of benefits, an EOB, that basically describes, the service that you had and how much we paid for you and all that. And these EOBs are just like awful, indecipherable. And I think that many health insurers, they forget that the EOB is actually the most common interaction point that a customer has with their health insurer.
Right.
But many health insurers just view it as like an administrative document, and they don't really pay it the attention that it deserves. So that's one thing that I think is a key issue. The other, I would say, is that I think companies get wrapped up in kind of the mechanics of the experience that they are delivering, and forget to step back and just really consider objectively, what does it really feel like to be our customer? I think particularly with companies sort of drowning in so much data these days that they're collecting, that they just lose sight of that simple precept, this idea of just, seeing the forest through the trees and just really contemplating, what does it actually viscerally feel like to be a customer when you interact with us at point of sale or point of service? And I think that's something that if companies did more of that, I think that it would really help steer their experience improvement efforts, much more positively.
If I may, John, I wanted to ask you, because those two things seem to be kind of linked in many ways, because it's more about being connected to the experience, there's overlooked touch points, and they're
right.
How significant they are, material they are in somebody's some experience, whether it's a EOB, as you mentioned, or whether it's a mobile or cell phone bill or utilities bill or whatever it might be, and people can get them and go, oh my word. And then all of a sudden, people going, what is that about? What's that about? What's about? And I remember talking to a gentleman called Jim Dixo at Sunday Sky about a situation that occurred at AT&T where they could track when their new subscriber bills went out or people had signed up to a new plan, as it were. They could see there's this massive, not correlation, but a causation. As bills kind of went out, then calls into the contact center went up because people were just going, what does that mean on my bill?
Yes.
And they completely lose sight of it.
Yeah, I'm actually quite familiar with that example with AT&T, and they did a number of things to really tackle that source of frustration among consumers. And I think that is a great example. Something as simple as a billing statement is sort of an unsung touch point. And companies don't recognize that it can be a material interaction point, and if it goes wrong, it actually cascades because it elicits unnecessary, avoidable inquiries that just put more stress on your operating infrastructure and, result in you delivering a worse customer experience at a higher expense. So it just goes wrong in many ways.
But going back to the point I got slightly sidetracked up. And I was going to say that these overlooked touch points and there's this loss of connection to what it feels like to be a customer. And it almost feels like you're saying that people in organizations and particularly leaders need to kind of go beyond the data, because as you say, that they've got so much kind of data, but they're sort of losing sight of what's important and what's not. I mean, are you basically saying people need to get out more?
Yes. Yeah, actually, absolutely. I am saying that. I don't want to suggest that data is not valuable. It is, provided it is framed in a way that offers insights. There's a lot of data out there, but not necessarily a lot of insights in many companies. But I do think that it's important to balance quantitative insights like that with qualitative insights. And, one of the things I talk about in the book is the notion that you need to go out into the wild and you need to observe your customer in their natural habitat, because inevitably I find when you do that, and if you have an in-depth discussion with a customer in their natural habitat as they're using your products or bastardizing your products to get it to do something it wasn't designed to do, inevitably you come back to the office with a whole host of great ideas that quite likely might not have been unearthed through the data that you were collecting, no matter how that was collected, if it was through surveys or some operational data, because very often those game-changing insights that you can get from going into the wild and observing customers, there are things that customers would never even think to tell you because they just sort of become accustomed and habituated to it. They don't even think that you could help them with that need. It might be something that they view as being totally disconnected from your core business. Yet, you might actually be able to do something to address that need, that hope, that aspiration. So, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think that you have to get out there, and the moment that you sort of just get kind of bottled up in the corner office or in the cubicles, and you're not forging that closer connection with customers, I think you start to lose sight of what's important to them, including, for example, the touch points and the interactions that really comprise the experience.
Absolutely.
So, as you said, they really are connected.
It feels like it's like we always have to embrace almost an anthropological study of our own business.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it is very anthropological. And I think that the customer experience designers and researchers who are really good at what they do, I think that they're really pulling from the heritage of that discipline.
Perfect. I mean, and another thing I wanted to ask you about in the that you talk about in the book, I think it's a really important plan because you make this analogy that customer experience is like this choreographed performance, and customers are like the fans, but that to bring off this performance, you have to have this marriage or interplay between on stage and off stage or backstage activities. And those are kind of equally important parts to be able to deliver this kind of great performance. But yet most of its customer experience can sometimes, as a discipline or an industry or even a debate or discussion, seems to kind of focus more on the on-stage stuff rather than the backstage stuff.
Yes. Yeah. Right. So, the analogy that I present in the book, which is, mind you, it's not the first time this analogy has been used. I mean, Disney, for example,
Yes.
calls their employees cast members, and they're, no matter where you work, you are considered to be, on stage to some degree. But I liken a great customer experience to a beautifully choreographed performance, because I think the analogy just works on many levels. The notion that you've got actors and actresses where nothing is left to chance. Every line of dialogue, every gesture, every movement of their body is choreographed in a way to elicit a reaction from the audience. The desired reaction, of course, being that at the end of the performance, they're on their feet, applauding, just wanting the encore, wanting more, and then leaving the theater and telling other people about it. That's where you want to end up. And so if you take the analogy a step further, I do think it's helpful to think about the customer experience equation as having this onstage component and the backstage component. And so the onstage component to me is everything that your customers can see, feel, hear, touch, smell, all of that. And as you note, I think that it is the onstage component where most people's heads go to when they think about customer experience. They're thinking about the website. They're thinking about that interaction over the sales counter at the retail store. It's those live interactions with these artifacts that the company puts out there in the marketplace. But then the backstage piece is the one that often gets overlooked. And what I mean by backstage, it's important that your listeners don't interpret that as back office. I'm not talking about that. By backstage, I mean everything that happens behind the curtain. That, while invisible to your customers, necessarily influences the quality of the experience that's going to be delivered to them. So, for example, we talked a moment ago about the importance of the internal customer experience, how you serve your colleagues. Well, that's something that happens backstage. If you're not delivering a great experience to your fellow actors and actresses, then it's going to be tougher for them to deliver a great performance, to the audience. But there are other aspects of that backstage environment that many people fail to think about, and that would be, for example, how you hire and select people to even join your theater troupe. Are you hiring people who really have the customer experience gene? Because it's a lot easier to teach people technical skills than it is to teach them that philosophy of being customer centric and having the empathy to create that great experience. So that's an example of a backstage element, or even how you measure and reward your workforce. That's something that, again, is completely invisible to your customers, but you can, of course, imagine if I'm rewarded a certain way for certain types of behaviors, it's going to incentivize that behavior. It's going to influence my performance on stage. So that's what I mean about the backstage and the onstage. And yes, I think that they are equally important components of a successful customer experience equation.
And do you think you also go into, in the book, you go on to talk about some of the biggest mistakes that companies make when they start embarking on a customer experience effort. I mean, is that connected to this kind of like not seeing it as a connected, holistic set of activities?
It totally is, because I think that in a sort of a sick sort of way, I think that many companies and business leaders that drive these kinds of customer experience improvement initiatives is they just find it's more fun to work on the onstage stuff. There's sort of more immediate gratification. We roll out that new website, or we create a new retail store format. It's like everybody can see it. It's wow, it's cool. It has sort of this immediate impact. And so the stuff backstage doesn't get as much attention as it should, because in some cases the impact of those backstage improvements might take a little while to get to the customer. I also think that there is a misconception among many executives when, if they're not even necessarily using the term backstage, but if they think about it in terms of the employee experience, they're immediately thinking about things like, well, our benefits and our perks. Do we give free lunch in the cafeteria? Are there foosball tables in the rec room? And those things all have value, but I think that a bigger driver in the engagement of employees and inspiring them really to deliver that great experience is in making sure that the environment that they're working in, the constructs in the workplace, the cues in the workplace are really aligned perfectly with your vision for the customer experience you aspire to deliver. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think that is a common mistake with companies where they're not paying attention to those types of backstage elements. There are some high-profile examples of companies that have had just awful customer experience failures. And then when they dissect it, when they do the postmortem on it, they realize it really was something backstage that was creating the problem. I think, one really good example I like to use of that concept is with United Airlines. Do you remember how a few years ago they actually dragged a passenger off one of their planes?
Dr. David Dow.
Because it was overbooked and nobody had volunteered, to give up their seat.
Yeah.
Well, you look at that and you say, how does a company get to a place like that? Well, when they kind of, evaluated what went on, they realized that their employees' hands were effectively tied in dealing with a situation like that. Mm-hmm. So, for example, it was just a matter of policy at United that the gate agents had a cap of $800 that they could offer to passengers to give up their seat voluntarily. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you ask United today, how much would you have offered anyone on that plane to get off so that you could have avoided the negative publicity with that whole scenario? They'd probably say we'd easily give, $50,000. But that was just a policy, which is a backstage element, invisible to customers, but it really constrained employees' ability to deliver a great customer experience. And that's an example of the need for really paying attention to those backstage drivers.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I remember that story very well. I think it was Dr. David Dow.
That's right. Yeah.
And it struck me at the time. I mean, it was horrifying what happened, but I think you're absolutely right. It was people acting within a set of rules which had there was no flexibility in them.
Right.
And seemingly not very much empowerment. But I think from an organizational perspective, it also made me think that actually you should always stress test your policies, because always the great things and the really bad things always happen sort of almost in extremis, or kind of when policies are
the black swan events.
Yeah, kind of like black swan events, or kind of the 101 chance sort of thing, or 1,001 chance. And these are the things that get caught out. But your policy might kind of seem innocuous, but if you don't stress test it, you don't understand or unearth these potential scenarios where some things can go, catastrophically wrong. And I think there is a lesson to it for everybody.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Yep.
So what I was going to say was the book is all about these 12 principles, and rather than actually listing them, because obviously you want people to go buy the book and imbibe them all themselves. But what I want to do is to kind of ask you to give us a flavor of the principles, and maybe you kind of pick out, I know they're probably like you've written about them, so they probably feel like you're kind of like you're authored children in kind of in book terms, as it were. So if you can pick 2 or 3 of your favorites that you'd like, or maybe some of the most non-obvious or neglected ones that you think, and tell us a bit about them, and tell us why you think they're important, and how maybe some brands are applying them just to bring them to life if you can.
Yeah, sure. So let me see. I'll highlight. I'll start by highlighting 2 for you. The first one is a principle called finishing strong.
Okay.
And this again goes back to this idea that good customer experience design really needs to be about memory shaping. Mm-hmm. It's not just about the mechanics of the experience. It's about how do people recall the experience. And the reason that is so important is because when one of your customers is asked by a friend or a colleague or a family member, if they say, oh, hey, I know that you worked with company X on so-and-so, I'm in the market for the same thing. So what did you think of them, company X? Well, the next thing that's going to come out of your customer's mouth in response to that question is not going to be based on the experience they had with your company. It's going to be based on what they remember about that experience. And given the way our brains are wired, those two things are actually a bit different. Mm-hmm. And so that's where this first principle comes in, this idea of finishing strong. And it's grounded in the cognitive science principle called the recency bias, mm-hmm. which basically means that the stuff that happens to us at the end of an experience exerts a disproportionate influence over our overall perceptions of the experience. So it's like you could just do a great job for your customer, in the early parts of that interaction episode. But if you end on a really awful, abysmal note, it's almost like everything that came before that is for naught, because mm-hmm. just the way our brains are wired, we're going to walk away with that final interaction point really shaping our overall perceptions, in a very significant way. And so, the advice here is that companies need to think about those endpoints in the experiences. And how do you make sure that you elevate the quality of that endpoint so that you are leveraging this cognitive science to leave that customer with an impression that's going to last for a while and actually could potentially outweigh some of the negative aspects of the experience that maybe came early on. Sure. And so one example that I use in the book of this technique comes from Alaska Airlines, which is a U.S. airline that, I think their claim to fame is that they actually were number one in passenger experience quality for 12 years in a row from the J.D. Power Consumer Survey, which is a very well-regarded survey within the airline industry of customer experience quality.
Wow.
And interestingly, this run of 12 years coincided with something that Alaska Airlines did in 2009. And that is they rolled out what they called their 25-minute baggage guarantee. And what it meant is that the minute the plane rolls up to the jet bridge and connects, the clock starts.
Right.
And if the bags are not delivered to the carousel within 25 minutes, it's actually now been updated to 20 minutes because they've gotten better at it. But originally it was 25 minutes. And if your bags were not rolling out on the carousel within 25 minutes, you would actually get, you had a choice of either getting a credit towards future flights, or you could get a credit towards your frequent flyer airline miles account.
Right.
So there was real teeth behind it. You would actually get something. And that is a great example of finishing strong because many airlines, they kind of neglect that final interaction point. So even if you wined and dined me on the flight, even if the in-flight entertainment was great and I enjoyed myself, even if the flight was on time, if I get to the baggage carousel and I have to wait 45 minutes for my bags to come out, that's going to tarnish everything because that's mm-hmm. the final touch point. And that's what I am going to remember about that experience. And so Alaska did a lot of things right, but one of them was focusing on that final interaction point and making sure that you're ending on a high point, a really unique point. So that's one example that I would give a principle. Let me pause there, see if you have any questions on that one.
Well, I mean, it's something that I've heard about before, and it's almost it gives, I feel like, balance to that, that old expression that says first impressions matter. But actually the end, what people forget off the end of that is that, but so do last impressions. And it's to that point as well. It's like that, you roll it all up and it's the primacy and recency effect. So right. we have stronger memories of things at the beginning and at the end of things. And I think you're absolutely right. And I've seen people do different things, people who appreciate that, and not many do. But when they do it, it has such a powerful effect.
Yeah. And I think that the important thing for people to understand is that there are really creative ways that you can leverage this principle, like really fascinating ways. For example, if you're a web designer and you've got an app that installs on someone's phone or on their desktop, you actually want to make sure that the progress bar that is showing the status of the installation, that it speeds up towards the end. Because I don't know if you've ever had this, but I've had software that I install and then it gets to 99%. and it just sticks there for ever. And that's actually bad, because that's kind of the end of that particular episode. And, it might be subtle and it might almost just be subconscious. But if you have a progress bar that speeds up as it gets to the end, it actually makes people feel better about that wait. It doesn't feel as bad. So, there really are curious ways that you can leverage this principle at touch points, large and small, to make people feel better about the interaction.
Oh, that's a cool example, because that's kind of like, that's design in the kind of in the minutiae.
Right. Yeah.
Brilliant. So the next one.
You want a second one?
Yeah, please.
So the second one is, as you said, these are all like my children. So I hate to pick a favorite, but I have to say that I do have kind of this special allegiance to this one, just because it's almost magical in the way it works. And the fact that it is pretty much costless to implement, yet has such a material impact on the quality of the experience and people's perceptions of it. And the principle is about giving people the perception of control. Right. And here's how it works. Basically, we as human beings, we are control freaks. We like to have our hands on the steering wheel. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that in many businesses, you can't give your customer direct control of the experience. If I am selling my home, I can't sell it myself. I have to sort of rely on a realtor to do that. If I go to a dentist to get a root canal, I can't do it myself. I have to, delegate that task to them. There are all kinds of business interactions where, by design, you lose control. But the research is really neat around this, because it's sort of revealed this concept of perceived control, this notion that even though people might not be in control of whatever experience they're going through, that if you give them the sense that they are in control, they will automatically feel better about the experience, even if you don't change anything about the underlying experience. So the cool psychology study that's referenced in the book that I love, that illustrates this point, it came from a University of Southern California psychology student. And he worked with the American Red Cross at a blood donation site. And he started off separating donors into two groups. One group just got kind of the standard experience, sit down, the nurse asks, what's your non-dominant arm, and takes the blood from that. Well, the other group, he had the nurse ask the donor, which arm would you like me to draw the blood from? Well, afterwards, when they asked people about the experience that they had, the researcher found that the folks who were given the opportunity to choose which arm to draw blood from actually reported having a much more favorable experience giving blood. They actually reported less pain, as a matter of fact. Wow. And so you say, well, what's up with that? And the answer is that you've given them a sense of agency. You've given them a sense of control. Even something so subtle as being able to choose what arm to draw the blood from makes me feel like I've got some control here. But it gets even more interesting, because then he repeated the study. And this time he had sort of a control group. And then he had another group where they didn't get to choose what arm the blood was drawn from, but they had to watch a 2-minute video before the procedure that explained in detail what was going to happen to them, what they were going to feel physiologically and psychologically. And then again, afterwards, he asked these people, how the experience was. The ones that watched the video up front, again, reported feeling less pain and having a better experience donating blood than others. And so what's going on there is that they were setting people's expectations up front. And merely by setting expectations, you actually give people the perception of control, because it removes ambiguity from the encounter. I know what's coming around the corner. I know what to expect. And so it lets me sort of start to wrap my head around it. So, these are two examples of how to give people perceived control. One is about conforming the experience to people's thoughts. So I want to use my left arm for this blood draw, and you give me a chance to do that. And the other is about conforming people's thoughts to the experience, which is setting expectations so they know how this is going to unfold. And so, the lesson is that if you just are really good, for example, at setting expectations with your customers and with your colleagues, that alone can make people feel better about the experience, even if the experience isn't getting any better, in truth. And I think in the business world, a great example of this is with line queuing. A known wait in a line has been shown to feel better and actually feel shorter than an unknown wait.
Sure.
And so, when you have people call contact centers and up front they're giving an estimated wait time, that's an example of conforming people's thoughts to the experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're setting that expectation. And then even better, if you say to them, hey, if you don't want to wait, we have the option where we'll call you back. Well, that's conforming the experience to people's thoughts, where they're saying, hey, I want some agency here. I want some options. Oh, you're going to, you give me the option to just be called back so I don't have to waste my life, waiting for you here on the phone. So that's an example in sort of a traditional business sense with a call center management of how the perception of control plays out.
I think there's kind of I think it's fascinating. I think those wait time and callback features, I think they've been known about for such a long time, and the technology to support them has been around for such a long time. It always surprises me how little they seem to get leveraged.
Yeah.
Now, I know that there's arguments, people can have sometimes problems with callback features because of the nature of the say the help desk or the contact center teams that they're working with and the technology, and can they do outbound rather than just inbound, and that's complicated. Mm-hmm. But the wait time thing, that's just provision of information. Then people are able to then make a choice, right?
Right.
And the amount of places where you don't see that is
shocking.
I mean, it's almost a bit like, if you flip it around, it's almost a bit like when you get a wait time estimate, it's a surprise because you don't see it very often, right?
Yeah. And I think that's such an important point. And again, that's why I love this principle, because it's just undiscovered country, for so many companies. And yet it's so easy to just flip the switch and start doing that. Mm-hmm. And as you say, it's surprising when somebody is clear in setting expectations with you. Another example is just, when you tell somebody you're going to call them back, you got to do some research or whatnot. What do a lot of people say? Well, I'll call you back shortly. Mm-hmm. Well, shortly means very different things to different people. That mm-hmm. creates ambiguity, and it creates a lost sense of control. Well, I don't know now. When am I going to hear from you? Well, if I just replace that word shortly with, I am going to call you back no later than 5 p.m. on Thursday.
Sure.
Well, right there, suddenly the tenor of the experience totally changes, because you've eliminated ambiguity from my life. I have a sense of control now. And as long as you deliver on your promise, that's going to be a better experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jon, I mean, that's brilliant. There's a great couple of examples. And ladies and gentlemen, there's another 10 in the book. So, you buy 2, get 10 for free.
Yeah.
But if we were to sum it all up and say, what do you think any business or brand can do today to sort of transform the experiences that they're delivering for both their customers and employees? Because I guess that's the kind of the point is, like, there's a lot they can do, but where would you say the kind of the biggest lever is kind of right now?
If the question is really how do you transform experiences for customers and employees simultaneously, I think the answer to that is to go with a really efficient approach that does both at the same time. And I think an example of that is to really, this is going to sound so simple, but again, it's one of these things, a lot of companies don't do this, but genuinely enlisting employees in the customer experience improvement effort is a great way to kind of kill 2 birds with one stone. Because a business's frontline staff are arguably the people who are most knowledgeable about what delights customers and what frustrates them. And so when management solicits customer experience improvement advice from the workforce, and this is an important one, and then acts on their suggestions, it actually makes the staff feel more valued. So it enhances the employee experience. It incentivizes them to continue providing feedback to the company to help improve the customer experience. But then, of course, because you're getting all of these great ideas and insights from your staff and capitalizing on them, you're simultaneously moving the needle on the quality of the customer experience. So, I would point to that technique just because it's very efficient in the sense that you are simultaneously engaging the two stakeholders that are really so critical to get on board in terms of delivering that great experience, because you're enlisting the employees in the effort, you're making them feel important and valued in the whole endeavor. And then because you are relying on their well-informed suggestions, you're using that to really focus on the right things in terms of improving the customer experience itself.
Maybe just a follow-on question from that. I mean, that sort of feels a bit self-evident to me, but it's not, obviously, because otherwise everybody would be doing it. And it's a bit like the wait time thing. It's surprising, kind of like, it's more surprising when it does happen rather than kind of, you're not surprised when it doesn't happen.
Right. And I think,
I guess my question was going to be, my question was going to be why does it not happen more often, do you think?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we were discussing with the idea of going out into the wild and observing your customers in their natural habitat. This is really no different. This is about going out into the wild and observing your employees in their natural habitat. I think that, what is the impediment? It is business leaders simply carving out time in their schedule and viewing this as a priority. Mm-hmm. I think many business leaders feel like, well, if I just get the report from the latest employee engagement survey, that's going to tell me what I need to know. Mm-hmm. And I'm not dissing those employee engagement surveys. I think, again, that's valuable data. But the mere act of going out and spending time with an employee in sales, in service, in marketing, in R&D, in manufacturing, whatever, I mean, it just helps your cause on so many levels. Mm-hmm. I mean, first, the fact that you as an executive, as a business leader, are just spending time with that employee immediately, that elevates people's view of management's engagement with employees and management's vested interest in helping to make employees as successful as they can in their jobs. So, there's just kind of a cultural impact. But then, of course, there's the mechanical impact of just getting good, unfiltered feedback from employees to not only understand what frustrates customers, but also what frustrates employees. What are the impediments and the obstacles that stand in their way, like the $800 cap maybe on dealing with an overbooking situation on an airline? What are the impediments that they run into where, despite their best efforts, their hands are tied and they can't deliver that consistently great experience? So yeah, I think that it is something that it's rare, and it just comes down to business leaders realizing how valuable that exercise is on so many levels and why it's so important to carve out time in their schedules and make that a priority.
Perfect. Jon, I wanted to kind of like sort of step away from the book right now. And because you're, as you say, you're founder and principal of Watermark Consulting, and you do a lot of advisory work, and you're sort of in the weeds for it, and you can write about it and think about it and talk about it and things. And so I wanted to ask you, and also to get your view on what the future of service and experience looks like, and what do you see as some of the big challenges that are coming that we need to be mindful of and figure out we're going to navigate?
Yeah. So I think that we need to prepare for a world where both customers and employees are increasingly empowered and emboldened, because across any industry, there is this inexorable march toward a state where there is greater and freer flow of information among customers and employees. There's increased flexibility for them to engage with businesses on their desired terms, often involving cutting out a middleman. Mm-hmm. And bottom line is, whether you like it or not, these customers, these employees increasingly are in the driver's seat. And I think in a world like that, you can't mandate engagement and loyalty. You have to earn it one day at a time by delivering such exceptional value to the people that you serve that they wouldn't ever dream of shifting their business elsewhere or quitting and going to work for another company. And I think that's what business leaders should be thinking about today, tomorrow, next week, and next year. How can I create a product, a service, a customer, an employee experience that is simply magnetic and draws people into my organization as opposed to repelling them or just leaving them indifferent.
Perfect.
I think that's the big challenge.
Well, thank you. That's great. So, John, what I wanted to do, I wanted to finish up on, unless there's anything else you wanted to add, I wanted to finish up on a couple of my ongoing research questions.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So, as I explained before we got started, is that, I published this book back in 2019 called Punk CX, and I've been doing this ongoing sort of word association collection process. And at the end of every interview, I've been asking each interviewee kind of a couple of things. And the first question I've been asking them is, what one word would you use to describe a more punk approach to customer experience? Now, I warn you, I have a list of 140 different words.
So are you going to tell me whether the one I give you is on the list?
I will. I'll tell you what, I'm going to pull up my list now.
All right. So here's the word that comes to my mind when I think about a punk approach to customer experience.
Mm-hmm.
It would be contrarian.
Ooh, let me just look that up.
Did I win? Do I get to come back and play for the car tomorrow?
I think you might do. Hold on. Crumbs. I think. Have a look. Yes, I think we will accept that answer.
Okay, we have a winner.
The producer is speaking in my ear.
So, yeah, I mean, that's the word that I would use. And the reason I use that is because when I think of a punk approach to customer experience, which, mind you, I know you are the expert in that. So I wouldn't purport to sort of, have cornered the market on the definition of punk. But at least in my vernacular, to me, that sort of exudes this sense of a company that's dispensing with traditional norms, that's really thinking about completely different way of engaging with customers, a way that removes common frustrations, that delivers value in a manner that people within that industry just have never delivered value before. So, to me, that's a very contrarian approach to business. And I think that I think there are examples of companies that have embraced that kind of approach and have really shaken up entire industries as a result. When they focus that contrarian effort around customer experience design.
Excellent. I love it. I love the idea that people keep coming out with their own kind of words, and it just shows you that it's such a broad church. And there's a lot of variety and a lot of scope to think differently and to innovate. And so my second question is that what company or brand do you think epitomizes a more punk CX ethos?
Right. So when I think about a company that's really embraced a contrarian approach, in my mind comes T-Mobile, the wireless carrier. And specifically T-Mobile under their just recently departed CEO who left the company after leading it for quite a few years, and that's John Ledger, who actually used to be an AT&T executive, but then went to T-Mobile. And if you or your listeners might remember, what they unveiled shortly after Ledger joined the company was what they called their Un-carrier strategy.
Yeah.
And to me, that is just the epitome of contrarian. I remember because I've written articles about this, when he launched the Un-carrier strategy back in March of 2013, what he said at the launch event was, "We're still a wireless company. We're just not going to act like one anymore."
Yeah.
And what was beautiful about the way they did it is so many companies try to advertise their way to a great customer experience. Many fewer actually back up the marketing promise with fulfillment of that promise. And that's really what T-Mobile did, because and this ties back to what we were just talking about. One of the first things Ledger did is he sat down in the call center and just listened to calls with his employees. And what he began to just hear from customers was about all the common friction points within the wireless industry: inflexible contracts, data overage charges, exorbitant fees for international roaming. And they basically designed a new experience for the wireless industry that addressed all of those frustrations. And what they really did is they dragged the entire industry kicking and screaming into a new era. Because if you look at the evolution of the wireless industry in the US, at least, other carriers followed T-Mobile's lead. They had to, because T-Mobile just created a much better mousetrap applying that contrarian view.
I know that story. And I think John Ledger he's a legend.
Yeah.
I love the next thing they came out with, I think, was customer service is broken. And then they kind of followed it on from there and did some very, very different things. And so, it's an absolutely brilliant example. So thank you for that.
Sure.
So John, that's all I have for you today. So with that in mind, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for producing the ROI of customer experience kind of research as an ongoing effort, because I know that I've used it and quoted it many times when I've kind of like talked to other clients or spoken at events. Congratulations on the new book, From Impressed to Obsessed.
Thank you.
And just thank you so much for spending some time with us today, telling us a little bit about the book and sharing some of your experience with us. That's been awesome.
It was my pleasure. And just so your listeners know, there's actually an updated version of that ROI study in the book. So if you like it, you can get the updated version and understand what those customer experience leaders are doing to achieve that outperformance. But Adrian, thank you for being on the show. I really enjoyed it. Great conversation.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. But one final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.